The boardroom at Ashford Memorial Hospital had never felt so cold, even though the July sun poured gold through the floor-to-ceiling windows overhead. 22 people sat around a table of dark walnut, coffee cups going lukewarm in front of them, waiting for a meeting that had been billed on the calendar as routine budget review. Nobody in that room, except for one man, knew it would end in humiliation. And nobody in that room, except for one woman, knew it would end in something far bigger than any of them could imagine. Margaret Calloway sat near the far end of the table, the way she always did, in the seat closest to the door, the seat nobody fought over, the seat reserved for people whose names got mispronounced in meeting minutes. She wore a plain gray blazer, her hair pulled back simply, a legal pad in front of her with careful, cramped handwriting filling every line. To anyone glancing her way, she looked like exactly what her title said she was: Director of Patient Records and Compliance. Quiet, unremarkable, the kind of employee people forgot was even in the room until they needed something signed. At the head of the table sat her husband, Dr. Richard Voss, Chief Administrator of Ashford Memorial, 51 years old, silver at the temples in a way that made him look distinguished rather than old, a smile that had opened doors in boardrooms across 3 states. He was the kind of man newspapers loved to photograph beside ribbon cuttings. Ashford Memorial had grown under his decade of leadership from a regional hospital struggling to stay solvent into a nationally recognized medical center, at least on paper, at least in the press releases his office issued twice a month. What the press releases did not say was that the hospital was hemorrhaging money in ways only a handful of people fully understood. And what nobody in that boardroom knew, what not even Richard himself knew, was that his quiet wife sitting near the door held the only signature in the entire state of Ohio that could keep Ashford Memorial's doors open past the next 18 months. "Let's move to item 4, Richard said, tapping his tablet, his voice smooth as poured concrete. Departmental restructuring. A murmur went through the room. Everyone had heard the rumors. Layoffs were coming. Nobody wanted to be the name on the list. As many of you know, Richard continued, standing now, walking a slow circuit behind his chair the way he always did when he wanted a room's full attention. We've been asked by the board to trim operational costs by 12% before the next fiscal quarter. That means difficult decisions. That means looking hard at every department, every position, every dollar. He paused near the window. The light caught his face at a flattering angle. Margaret watched him do this and felt something she had felt many times over 11 years of marriage. Not surprise, not even hurt anymore, just a tired, familiar recognition. He performed. Even here, even now, even with people's jobs on the line, he performed. "I've made the difficult decision," Richard said, "to eliminate the patient records and compliance directorship, effective immediately, and to fold those responsibilities into the newly restructured Office of Strategic Operations." The room went very still. Margaret did not move. Her pen did not stop its slow, even motion across the legal pad in front of her. She had known this was coming for 6 days. She had watched the calendar invite appear on Richard's shared schedule, watched the quiet meetings he'd taken with human resources that he thought she hadn't noticed, watched the way he had stopped meeting her eyes at breakfast. 11 years of marriage taught a woman to read a man's silences the way sailors read the sky before a storm. What she had not expected was for him to do it here, in front of everyone. "Margaret," Richard said, and something in his voice shifted, hardened, the way it did when he wanted to close a conversation quickly and cleanly, like ripping tape off skin. "Your position is being eliminated. Effective today. HR will process your severance according to standard policy." 21 faces turned toward her at once. She felt the weight of every one of them, felt the particular cruelty of being stripped of something in a room full of witnesses, felt the specific humiliation reserved for people who are fired not just from a job, but from a marriage disguised as a job, in front of colleagues who would gossip about it over lunch within the hour. Beside Richard, seated at his right hand where his executive assistant used to sit, was Danielle Reyes, the newly promoted Vice President of Communications and Public Affairs. 31 years old, magazine-ready, a laugh that carried down hallways. Margaret had suspected for 4 months. She had known for 6 weeks. She had simply been waiting for the moment Richard would stop pretending, because pretending, she had learned, were the only thing that gave him comfort. Danielle did not quite hide her smile. Margaret set her pen down. She folded her hands on the table, the way her father had taught her to do decades ago, before board meetings of his own, in a boardroom that no longer existed under that name but whose walls, if anyone bothered to check the county deed records, had never actually stopped belonging to her family. "I understand," Margaret said. Her voice was calm, steady, almost gentle. It was not the voice of a woman being destroyed. It was the voice of a woman who had already, quietly, made peace with an ending that everyone else in the room believed was only just beginning. "Security will help you collect your belongings," Richard said, already looking down at his tablet, already moving to the next item on the agenda as if he had just approved a change to the cafeteria menu. "Thank you for your years of service, Margaret. Thank you for your years of service." As though she were a vendor contract being terminated. As though there had not been 11 years of dinners, of late nights holding his hand through his father's funeral, of her quietly rewriting 3 of his keynote speeches after he'd handed her drafts full of errors 2 hours before he was due on stage, of her standing beside him at every hospital gala smiling the practiced smile of a woman who had learned long ago that being seen and being valued were not the same thing. Margaret, she did not rush. She gathered her legal pad, her pen, the small leather folio she had carried into every meeting at Ashford Memorial for the past 9 years. She did not look at Danielle. She looked, briefly, at Richard, and in that look there was no rage, no tears, nothing that would have given the room the satisfaction of a scene. "Before I go," she said, and her voice carried easily across the long table, "I want to say one thing." Richard glanced up, a flicker of irritation crossing his face, the look of a man who wanted this handled quickly and quietly, who had not anticipated his soon-to-be former director of records would ask for the flaw. "I hope," Margaret said, "that everyone in this room remembers exactly how today felt. Because I have a feeling this hospital is about to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between the people who are loud and the people who are necessary." Nobody understood what she meant. Not yet. She walked out of the boardroom without another word, her heels quiet against the marble floor, her spine straight, her face unreadable. Behind her, she heard Richard clear his throat and say, moving on to item 5, as though nothing at all had happened, as though a woman's decade of loyalty could be filed away as efficiently as a completed form. What Richard did not know, what none of them knew, was that the woman walking calmly out of that boardroom was not simply his wife. She was not simply a records director whose department had grown inconvenient. Margaret Calloway, born Margaret in Ashworth, was the sole surviving heir of Walter Ashworth, the man who had built the original Ashworth Regional Clinic on a patch of donated farmland 53 years earlier, the man whose private family trust, quietly renamed and restructured decades ago, hidden behind layers of legal language most people would never bother to read, still held the controlling deed to the land beneath Ashford Memorial Hospital and majority ownership of the endowment. That had, 3 times in the last 20 years, kept the hospital's doors from closing for good. Richard Voss had built his career, his reputation, his entire public identity as the man who saved Ashford Memorial. He had never once known that the woman he married had already saved it long before he arrived. And he had just fired the only person standing between his hospital and collapse. The parking garage was quiet at that hour, sunlight slanting through the concrete openings in long golden bars. Margaret walked to her car, a modest sedan, nothing like the luxury SUV Richard drove, nothing like the image the hospital's PR department liked to project about its leadership, and sat behind the wheel for a long moment without starting the engine. She did not cry. She had expected to, somewhere in the back of her mind, in the version of this moment she had rehearsed for weeks. But sitting there, in the gray hush of the garage, what she felt instead was something closer to relief, tangled up with grief so old it had calcified into something almost peaceful. Her phone buzzed on the passenger's seat. A text from Danielle's assistant, forwarded from HR. Already, please return your hospital badge and any confidential materials by end of day. Margaret looked at the badge clipped to her blazer. 9 years of her life reduced to a laminated rectangle with a photograph taken on a day she'd had the flu and hadn't wanted to reschedule. She unclipped it, set it on the passenger seat beside the phone, and finally allowed herself one long breath, in and out, the kind of breath a person takes before stepping off solid ground into water they cannot see the bottom of. Then she picked up her phone and, instead of calling a friend, instead of calling her sister, instead of doing any of the things a newly fired, newly humiliated woman might be expected to do, she opened her contacts and pressed the name of the man she had not called directly in almost 4 years. Edmund Cole, trustee, Ashworth Family Foundation. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm with genuine surprise. Margaret, it's been a while. Edmund, she said, and there was something in her tone that made the old man on the other end of the line go instantly quiet, instantly alert, the way a longtime family lawyer learns to recognize the sound of history turning a corner. I think it's time we activated the review clause. There was a pause. Are you certain? Once we begin the audit process, there's no quiet way to unwind it. The board will have to be formally notified. The trust's ownership stake becomes a matter of record. Margaret looked through the windshield at the concrete pillar in front of her car, at the faint reflection of her own tired eyes in the glass. I've spent 11 years being quiet, Edmund, she said. I think it's time people found out exactly who they've been dealing with. To understand how a hospital administrator could fire his own wife without ever knowing she was the one thing keeping his entire institution alive, you have to go back. Not far, just far enough to see the beginning of a story that most people in that boardroom believed started and ended with a marriage, when in truth it began 53 years earlier in a much smaller, much dustier room, with a man named Walter Ashworth signing his name to a deed nobody in the county expected to matter. Walter had been a country doctor before he was anything else, the kind who delivered babies at 2 in the morning and never once complained about being paid in eggs and firewood when families couldn't afford his fee. In 1971, he took the small inheritance from his own father's tobacco farm and, instead of building himself a bigger house, built a 16-bed clinic on the edge of town, because the nearest hospital was 4 to 5 minutes away and he had watched too many people die in the back seats of cars on that stretch of highway. He named it nothing grand, Ashworth Regional Clinic. He ran it for 30 years, expanded it twice, and when the county's larger hospital network came calling with an offer to absorb the clinic into what would eventually become Ashford Memorial, Walter agreed, but only on the condition that the land beneath it, and a controlling share of whatever endowment was built from its eventual growth, would remain in a private family trust. Not for money, not for ego. Walter Ashworth had written into that trust document, in his own plain handwriting, a single guiding clause that Edmund Cole had kept framed on his office wall for 30 years. The purpose of this trust is to ensure that no hospital built on this land shall ever be permitted to fail the community it was built to save, regardless of who sits in its administrative chair. Margaret was Walter's only grandchild. Her own parents had died in a car accident when she was 9, and it was Walter who raised her. Walter who taught her to read a balance sheet before she could drive, Walter who sat her down at 17 years old and told her that one day the trust would be his to protect, and that the single most important skill she would ever need was the patience to remain invisible until the moment invisibility stopped saving anyone. She had gone on to medical school herself, briefly, before switching to healthcare administration and public health, a decision Walter never questioned, understanding that his granddaughter's gift was not for the operating room but for the machinery behind it, the quiet architecture that decided whether an operating room could stay open at all. She had built a career of her own before she ever met Richard Voss, working for 8 years at a hospital system 2 states away, quietly earning a reputation among a small circle of healthcare finance professionals as someone who could read a failing institution's books and tell you, within a week, exactly where the bodies were buried. She met Richard at a healthcare finance conference in Chicago, when she was 31 and he was 35, a rising administrator with an easy charm and a hunger for advancement that she mistook, in those early years, for ambition worth admiring. He did not know, when he asked her to dinner that first night, that the quiet woman across the table with the sharp questions about capital reserves was the granddaughter of the man whose trust still owned the land his own hospital sat on. She did not tell him, not because she meant to deceive him, not at first, but because Walter had taught her caution the way other grandfathers taught fishing, and by the time she might have told him, 3 years into the marriage, she had already begun to see the parts of Richard that made her glad she hadn't. He was not a cruel man, not in the beginning. He was simply a man who needed to be the smartest person in every room, and a wife who quietly understood the finances of his own hospital better than he did was, to a man like that, not an asset. It was a threat he could not name. So instead he did what men like Richard often do. He found small ways to diminish her, to make her feel that her intelligence was a burden she should keep to herself, that her value lay in supporting his rise rather than pursuing her own. When Ashford Memorial had a records directorship open 8 years into their marriage, Margaret took it. Not for the title, not for the modest salary, but because Walter, in his final years, had asked her to keep watch. Someone from our family needs to be inside those walls, he told her from his hospital bed, 3 months before he died. Not to run it, just to watch it. Institutions forget who saved them faster than people do. She had kept that promise for 9 years. She had watched Richard's hospital grow more indebted with every expansion he approved for the sake of press coverage, watched him chase accolades instead of solvency, watched the slow erosion of an institution her grandfather had built to never fail the people who needed it. And through all of it, she had said almost nothing, because Edmund Cole had explained to her, patiently, year after year, that the moment the Ashworth Trust's involvement became public, the hospital's entire financial picture, every loan covenant, every bond rating, every vendor contract, would be thrown into instant, chaotic scrutiny. Silence had been protection. Silence had kept the hospital's fragile financial structure from collapsing under its own complexity. But silence, Margaret had learned that morning in the boardroom, had a cost too. And Richard had just made that cost impossible to ignore any longer. 3 days after the firing, Ashford Memorial's chief financial officer, a nervous, overworked man named Peter Delgado, walked into Richard Voss's office holding a folder he had been dreading opening for a month. "We have a problem," Peter said, closing the door behind him. Richard did not look up from his monitor, where he was reviewing draft language for a press release announcing Ashford Memorial's strategic realignment, the phrase his PR team had settled on to describe the layoff quietly rolling through 3 departments that week. "Every week we have a problem, Peter. Which one is today's?" "The Meridian Health line of credit," Peter said. "They're calling it due. All of it. $41 million, due in 90 days. Richard's hand stilled on the mouse. "That's not possible. We renegotiated those terms last spring." "We renegotiated the interest rate," Peter said, his voice tight. "Not the maturity date. And there's a covenant clause I missed. I missed it, Richard. I'll own that. Tied to our debt-to-asset ratio. Since we took on the new surgical wing construction loan in March, we've tripped the covenant. Meridian has the legal right to call the loan. And this morning, they exercised it." Richard stood up slowly, the color draining from his face. $41 million. In 90 days. "We don't have it," Peter said. "Not liquid. Not close. If we can't refinance or find a new lender in 90 days, Meridian can force us into receivership. They can take the surgical wing. They can take equipment. In a worst-case scenario, Richard, they can force a sale of hospital assets to satisfy the debt." The words hung in the air of the office like smoke that wouldn't clear. Richard sat back down heavily. For the first time in 10 years of running Ashford Memorial, he understood, with a coldness that settled into his stomach like a stone, that the hospital he had spent a decade building his name around was 3 months away from potentially ceasing to exist, and he had no idea how to stop it. "Get me every lender who's ever expressed interest," Richard said. "Every bank. Every private equity fund that's sniffed around us in the last 5 years. I want a list by tomorrow morning." Peter hesitated at the door. "Richard, there's something else." "What?" "The land," Peter said carefully. "Under the main campus. I was pulling title records for the refinancing package, in case we need to offer additional collateral. The deed isn't held by the hospital system." Richard frowned. "What do you mean it isn't held by the hospital system? We've operated on that land for 50 years. "It's held by a private trust," Peter said. "Has been the entire time. The Ashworth Family Foundation. We've never actually owned the ground the hospital sits on, Richard. We've been operating under a long-term lease agreement this whole time. One that, frankly, I didn't even know existed until I dug into the archives this week. Richard stared at him. That's absurd. I would know if we didn't own our own land. Would you? Peter asked, and there was something almost pitying in his voice. Richard, when's the last time anyone actually read the founding documents from when Ashworth Regional merged into the hospital system? Because I did, last night, at 11 o'clock, because I was desperate, and I found something you need to see. He set the folder on Richard's desk and opened it to a page marked with a yellow tab. There's a clause, Peter said, a right of first refusal. If Ashford Memorial ever defaults on its debts, or if hospital operations are materially disrupted, the trust holding the land has a contractual right to intervene, to restructure, to bring in new leadership, even to reclaim operational control, all before any outside creditor can force a liquidation. It's an old clause. Nobody's ever had to use it, but it's still legally binding. Richard's mouth went dry. Who runs this trust? Peter flipped to another page, this one showing the trust's registered officers, a list that had not been updated publicly in years, filed away in county records nobody at the hospital had thought to check because nobody had ever needed to. The trustee of record is a man named Edmund Cole, Peter said. But the beneficial owner, the person who actually controls the trust voting shares, is listed as Margaret Ashworth Calloway. For a long moment, Richard Voss did not move. That's not possible, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's her legal name, Richard, Peter said gently. Ashworth was her maiden name before your marriage. I didn't put it together either, until I saw the date the trust was established, and the name of the man who founded it. Walter Ashworth. I looked him up. He's listed in old county records as Margaret's grandfather. Richard sat in silence, staring at the document in front of him, at his own wife's, his own former wife's. He corrected himself, though the divorce wasn't even filed yet, though he hadn't even told her he intended to file, name typed cleanly beside the words beneficial owner, controlling interest. He thought of every gala, every fundraiser. Every year Margaret had stood quietly beside him in a modest dress while he shook hands and accepted plaques with his name engraved on them. He thought of the boardroom 3 days earlier, of her calm voice saying, I hope everyone in this room remembers exactly how today felt, and a cold, sick understanding began to spread through his chest. She had known. She had always known. And he had just fired her. Margaret's apartment, a small, rented 2-bedroom she had moved into 11 days earlier, after finally, quietly, telling Richard she wanted a separation, before he could beat her to the announcement in his own way, was not luxurious. It did not need to be. She had never needed the trappings Richard had spent their marriage chasing. What it had was a good reading chair by the window, a stack of unread novels she had promised herself she'd finally get to, and, that particular evening, Edmund Cole sitting across from her at a small kitchen table with a laptop open between them. The audit team finished the preliminary review this afternoon, Edmund said, adjusting his glasses. He was 73 years old, silver-haired, precise in his movements the way men become after 50 years of practicing law carefully enough to never make a mistake that mattered. Margaret, it's worse than we thought. Show me, she said. He turned the laptop toward her. Rows of numbers filled the screen. Debt schedules, covenant breaches, vendor payment delays stretching back 8 months, a surgical wing expansion that had run 40% over budget, malpractice reserve funds that had been quietly drawn down to cover operational shortfalls in a maneuver that, Edmund noted grimly, sat in a legal gray zone that regulators would have serious questions about if they ever looked closely. Richard approved the reserve fund drawdowns personally, Edmund said. Twice. Both times without full board disclosure. Both times to cover cash flow gaps that should have triggered a public financial warning under state hospital solvency regulations. Margaret scrolled through the numbers slowly, her expression unreadable, though something behind her eyes had gone very still, the particular stillness of a woman absorbing confirmation of something she had feared for a long time but never allowed herself to fully believe. He's been lying to the board, she said quietly. He's been lying to everyone, Edmund said, including, I suspect, himself. Richard Voss built his career on the story that he saved this hospital. The truth is has been running it on borrowed time, borrowed money, and borrowed patience for at least 3 years, papering over the cracks with press releases and ribbon cuttings while the actual foundation crumbled underneath him. And now Meridian Health has called the loan. $41 million, due in 90 days, Edmund confirmed, which they are legally entitled to do, and which the hospital, in its current state, cannot pay. Margaret closed the laptop slowly and sat back in her chair, looking out the window at the darkening street below, at the ordinary lives of ordinary people passing by who had no idea that 3 miles away, an entire hospital's future was balanced on a signature she alone possessed. "What happens if I do nothing?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "If you do nothing," Edmund said carefully, "Meridian forecloses. They likely force Ashford Memorial into receivership within 4 to 6 months. A bankruptcy court appoints a trustee who has no obligation to preserve services, no obligation to your grandfather's founding mission, no obligation to the 1,100 employees who work there or the community that depends on that emergency room. Assets get liquidated to satisfy creditors. In the worst outcome, the hospital closes entirely, and this community loses its only Level 2 trauma center 4 to 5 minutes from the next nearest facility, the exact gap your grandfather built that hospital to close in the first place." Margaret closed her eyes. "And if I intervene?" "Then you invoke the trust's right of first refusal," Edmund said. "Publicly. You take operational control before Meridian can force liquidation. You restructure the debt using the trust's own capital reserves, which, I should remind you, have grown considerably in 50 years of conservative management, more than enough to cover a bridge loan of this size. You install new leadership. You expose the financial mismanagement that got the hospital into this position in the first place. And you do all of it as the person the entire hospital has spent 9 years dismissing as a quiet records director nobody bothered to properly see." For a long moment, Margaret said nothing at all. She thought of her grandfather's voice, worn thin near the end but still certain, still steady. "Someone from our family need to be inside those walls. Not to run it, just to watch it." She thought of 11 years of being underestimated, of standing silently in Richard's shadow at events where men twice her intellectual weight received applause for ideas she had quietly corrected in private the night before. She thought of the boardroom, of 21 faces turning to watch her be discarded, of Danielle Riz's half-hidden smile. And she thought, too, of Peter Delgado's overworked face, of the nurses she had worked alongside for 9 years who had no idea their pensions were sitting inside a reserve fund being slowly drained to keep a failing expansion project alive, of the patients in the emergency room at that very moment who had no idea how close their hospital was to disappearing entirely. This had never been about revenge. Not really. Whatever satisfaction might come later, whatever reckoning Richard Voss had coming to him, that was not the reason Walter Ashworth had built a trust with teeth 50 years ago. He had built it because institutions forget who saved them, and someone needed to remember on their behalf. "Draft the notice," Margaret said finally, opening her eyes. "I want it filed with the board and the State Hospital Licensing Authority by Friday. And Edmund, I want Richard to hear it from me directly, before he reads it in a legal filing." Edmund studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies someone he has known since she was a small girl clutching her grandfather's hand at a groundbreaking ceremony, and sees, for the first time, the full weight of the woman she has become. "He fired you without ever asking why you were so calm about it," Edmund said quietly. "I think it's time he found out. If you made it this far, you already know this isn't just a story about a hospital. It's a story about every person who has ever been underestimated by someone who mistook their silence for weakness. If that's ever been you, do us a favor and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. It genuinely helps this story find the people who need to hear it, and we read every single one. And if you want to see exactly how Margaret Calloway walks back into that hospital and what happens the moment Richard Voss realizes who he actually married, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next is only the beginning. Richard Voss did not sleep that night. He sat in his office long after the building had emptied, long after Danielle had texted twice asking if he was coming home, not to their house, technically, since Margaret had moved out, but to the townhouse he quietly begun renting for the two of them, a fact he had not yet had the courage to make fully official. He did not answer either text. He sat instead with Peter's folder open in front of him, reading the trust documents again and again as though a fourth or fifth reading might change what they said. He thought back through 11 years of marriage, searching for the moment he should have known, and found, to his own quiet horror, that the signs had been there the entire time, simply invisible to a man who had never bothered to look closely at the woman standing beside him. The way Margaret had corrected, gently, almost apologetically, an error in his keynote speech about the hospital's founding history 2 years earlier, a detail about the original clinic's opening date that he had gotten slightly wrong, and that she had known instantly, without needing to check a single reference. The way she had once mentioned, in passing, early in their marriage, that her grandfather had been involved in healthcare before Richard, uninterested, had changed the subject to his own career trajectory. The way she had never once, in 11 years, asked him for anything. Not jewelry, not vacations, not the kind of status symbols Danielle had already begun hinting at after only 4 months of secret involvement, because a woman who quietly owned the ground beneath his entire professional identity had never needed anything he could give her. He felt something sharp and unfamiliar twist through his chest, something he didn't immediately recognize because he had spent so many years avoiding it. Shame. His phone buzzed. A text. Not from Danielle this time, but from Margaret. The first message she had sent him since the boardroom. I'd like to meet tomorrow morning. Ashworth Room, 9 a.m. Bring Peter and the board chair. There's something you need to hear directly from me before it becomes a legal filing. Richard stared at the message for a long time. The Ashworth Room was a modest, rarely used conference space on the hospital's 3rd floor, named, he realized now, with a chill, after the very family he had just discovered secretly controlled everything he thought he owned. He had walked past that room 1,000 times without once wondering why it carried that particular name. He typed back a single word, okay, and then sat alone in his office until the sun rose over the parking garage where, 4 days earlier, his wife had sat quietly in her car and made a phone call that had already set in motion the end of the world as he understood it. By the time Richard arrived at the Ashworth Room the next morning, Peter Delgado was already seated, pale and visibly exhausted, along with Eleanor Whitfield, the hospital's board chair, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who had spent 30 years on hospital boards and had learned, in that time, never to be surprised by anything. Until, that morning, she was. Margaret walked in at exactly 9 o'clock, Edmund Cole beside her carrying a slim leather portfolio, and something about the way she entered the room, unhurried, composed, utterly certain, made every person seated at that table understand, before she said a single word, that the balance of power had already shifted, and that they were only now catching up to a truth that had existed the entire time. Thank you all for coming, Margaret said, taking a seat not at the foot of the table, where she had always sat, but at its head, the seat Richard had occupied without thinking for the entirety of their marriage. He noticed. He said nothing. 4 days ago, Margaret continued, I was terminated from my position as Director of Patient Records and Compliance in front of this hospital's leadership by my husband, in what I believe was intended to make room for a promotion for someone with whom he has been having a personal relationship for approximately 4 months. Eleanor Whitfield's eyes flicked sharply toward Richard, whose jaw tightened but who did not deny it. That is, frankly, a personal matter, and not why I called this meeting, Margaret said, her voice never rising, never wavering. I called this meeting because this hospital is 90 days away from a $41 million loan default that will very likely force it into receivership, and because very few people in this room fully understand why that default happened, or what it will cost this community if it isn't stopped. Margaret, Richard started, his voice tight, I don't think this is the appropriate. I'm not finished, Margaret said, and something in her tone, not loud, not sharp, simply absolutely final, silenced him instantly, in a way 21 years of boardroom confidence never had. She opened Edmund's portfolio and slid a single document across the table toward Eleanor Whitfield. My legal name is Margaret Ashworth Calloway, she said. My grandfather, Walter Ashworth, founded the original clinic that became this hospital 53 years ago. When his clinic merged into the larger hospital system, he retained, through a private family trust, permanent ownership of the land this campus sits on, along with a controlling interest in the endowment fund that has quietly kept this institution solvent through 3 prior financial crises this board was never fully informed about, because they were resolved before they became public. I am the beneficial owner of that trust. Effective this morning, I am formally invoking a right of first refusal clause written into this hospital's founding agreement 53 years ago, a clause that grants the trust the legal authority to assume emergency operational control of Ashford Memorial before any outside creditor can force liquidation of its assets. The room had gone absolutely silent. Eleanor Whitfield's hands, holding the document Margaret had slid toward her, had gone slightly still, her eyes moving rapidly across the legal language, her face shifting from confusion to disbelief to something that looked almost like awe. "You're the trust," Eleanor said quietly. "I've always been the trust," Margaret said. "I simply chose, for 9 years, to work quietly inside this institution rather than above it, because my grandfather taught me that the best way to protect something is to understand it completely before anyone knows you're watching." Richard's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me?" Margaret turned to look at him, not with anger, not even, anymore, with hurt, but with something quieter and somehow far more devastating: clarity. "Because in 11 years of marriage, Richard, you never once asked me a question about myself that wasn't really about you," she said. "You never asked why I chose public health administration over the medical career I'd started. You never asked about my grandfather beyond the polite 5 minutes required at his funeral. You built an entire identity around being the man who saved this hospital. And I let you have that story, because I loved you, and because I believed, for a very long time, that the story mattered less than the marriage. You taught me otherwise 4 days ago, in front of 21 people, when you decided my years of service could be dismissed in a single sentence, so you could make room at this table for someone who laughs at your jokes and doesn't understand your balance sheet well enough to ever challenge you." Danielle's name was never spoken directly, but everyone in the room understood exactly whom Margaret meant. Peter Delgado stared fixedly at the table. Eleanor Whitfield had not looked away from Margaret since she began speaking. "What happens now," Eleanor asked carefully, "is entirely up to Mrs." She paused. "Ms. Ashworth. Calloway is fine, for now," Margaret said. "As for what happens now, I'm not here to bang this hospital to the ground out of spite, Eleanor, whatever satisfaction that might offer. I'm here because 1,100 employees and a community 4 to 5 minutes from the next nearest trauma center deserve leadership that didn't get us into a $41 million hole while draining malpractice reserve funds to hide it. The trust is prepared to provide bridge financing to cover the Meridian default immediately. In exchange, the trust will require full operational restructuring, an independent audit made public, a new executive leadership answerable to a board with genuine oversight, not one that rubber stamps whatever story gets told in the next press release." She looked, finally, directly at Richard. "You have a choice to make," she said. "You can cooperate fully with this transition, resign your position with dignity, and allow this hospital the chance to recover the way my grandfather—" Occasionally, old colleagues would mention having seen him, quieter now, they said, more careful, a man who had learned, the hard way, that reputation built on performance rather than substance collapses the moment anyone bothers to check the foundation. Margaret, for her part, did not seek credit. She gave one interview, a short, careful piece with a regional paper, in which she spoke almost entirely about her grandfather, about the 16-bed clinic he'd built with a small inheritance and a stubborn belief that no one in his community should die on a highway 4 to 5 minutes from help. When the reporter asked about her marriage, about the boardroom firing that had, by then, become something of local legend, Margaret offered only a brief, measured answer. "I think," she said, "there's a common mistake people make about quiet people. They assume quiet means small. It doesn't. Sometimes quiet just means someone has decided the moment hasn't come yet." The reporter asked if she felt vindicated. Margaret considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I feel relieved," she said. "Vindication is about being right. This was never about being right. It was about making sure a promise I made to my grandfather didn't get broken because I was too afraid to be seen." 6 months after the boardroom firing that had once seemed like the end of her career, Margaret stood in the newly renovated lobby of Ashford Memorial for the hospital's rededication ceremony, a modest event, nothing like the extravagant galas Richard used to throw for far smaller milestones. There were no luxury cars lining the entrance, no press releases boasting about a visionary leader's triumph. Just employees, many of them in scrubs on their lunch break, gathered to watch a small bronze plaque get unveiled beside the original one that had hung near the entrance for 50 years, honoring Walter Ashworth and the 16-bed clinic where it all began. The new plaque read simply, "In honor of those who protect what others overlook." Dr. Sandra Whitlock, now chief administrator, spoke briefly about the hospital's recovery, a debt restructuring plan now firmly on track, a profit-sharing initiative for staff launched that spring, a new nurse-to-patient ratio policy that had already begun improving morale across every floor. Peter Delgado, promoted to chief financial officer with a mandate for full board transparency, stood near the front, looking, for the first time in over a year, genuinely at ease. An elderly maintenance worker named Harold, who had kept the boilers running at Ashford Memorial for 31 years, longer than almost anyone else on staff, approached Margaret near the edge of the crowd as the ceremony wound down. He didn't know the details of the trust, the covenant breach, the boardroom firing that had set the whole story in motion. He only knew what everyone on the ground floor of that hospital had come to understand in the months since, that the quiet woman from records had somehow saved their jobs, their pensions, their patients, their community's only trauma center. "Most people who save a place like this," Harold said, "want their name on the building." Margaret smiled, watching the late afternoon light fall across the lobby, across the plaque bearing her grandfather's name. "My grandfather never wanted his name on anything," she said. "He wanted the doors to stay open. That's all this was ever about, Harold. Not names, just doors that stay open for people who need them." She stayed a while longer after the ceremony ended, walking slowly through hallways she had walked for 9 quiet years as someone nobody thought twice about, and then walked out to her modest sedan in the same parking garage where, months earlier, she had sat behind the wheel and made the phone call that changed everything. Not out of anger, not out of a desire for revenge, but out of a promise kept, finally, in full daylight, to a man who had taught her that the truest kind of strength rarely announces itself before it's ready. As she pulled out of the garage and onto the road home, the hospital's lights glowing warm behind her in the gathering dusk, Margaret Calloway did not think about Richard Voss or Danielle Reyes, or the boardroom where she had once been discarded in front of 21 witnesses. She thought instead about a 16-bed clinic on a patch of donated farmland, about a promise made beside a hospital bed, and about every person who has ever been underestimated by someone too loud to notice the quiet ones were the only thing holding everything together. Some people spend their whole lives trying to be seen. Margaret Calloway spent Hayes learning exactly when being seen would matter most. And when that moment finally came, it wasn't a performance. It was simply the truth, standing calmly at the head of the table, right where it had belonged the entire time. If this story moved you even a little, you already know why we tell them. Somewhere out there, someone is being underestimated right now, quietly carrying more strength than anyone around them realizes, and maybe this story finds them at exactly the right moment. If it found you at the right moment too, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and which part hit hardest. It helps more than you know, and we read every single one. Subscribe if you want more stories like Margaret's, the quiet ones who were never actually small at all, because there's always another one waiting to be told.